CLASSICOPIA concert. This is the second one we have done at the home of Andy Bauman, and we thank Andy for opening up his doors again. We really appreciate it. We did a two-piano program here, and now we've sort of moved one piano out. We have a single piano, and we're really excited to have a colleague that has come over from Germany. Anna Pelzer is our violist, a wonderful performer who I actually met when she was about 13 or 14, and she came to a music camp that I was teaching at. At that time, she was playing violin, and then we lost touch, and then a few years ago, some mutual friends said, oh, we have to bring over this violist from Germany, she's fantastic. And we took one look at each other like, wait a second, I know you. And so we've been performing some concerts now. This is the first one we've done with just viola and piano. A really great, powerful sound. She went to Yale, as you can see, grew up in Princeton area, but for the last 20 years has been freelancing or so, 12 years or so in Germany, playing with various orchestras as the principal violist, and so we're really happy to have her here. And she is the one who suggested this really interesting program of all women composers. The last piece by Rebecca Clark is a sort of well-known piece for this combination, and we knew that we wanted that to be the closer. And then we started researching some of these other women who, some of them I had not heard of. The second composer, Fernanda Crook, I had never heard that name, but a really fascinating piece of music. And we're also going to do Louisa Lebeau and Dora Pejacevic, who we have recently played a couple pieces of theirs, really beautiful romantic music. And we also have a special guest who will play right after our intermission, and that is Miss Yumi Durescher, a 10-year-old pianist who has played many times at our concerts, was also at our summer music camp, and is actually playing another piece for me tomorrow in a master class with a trio she's working on. This morning we had another master class with two different chamber groups that are performing right now. So it's a lot of really exciting things happening with CLASSICOPIA, and I'm glad you're a part of it. If you're not on our email list and want to find out about all of our concerts, you can sign up for that here. We come do concerts almost every month in the area, all kinds of wonderful things, and I'll tell you about the next one at intermission. But I want to begin, before I begin with the talking about Louisa Lebeau. Every time I do a concert with women composers, I have to mention some horrible quotes by men about women and how they really can't be composers. Aristotle, talking about women in general, way back in the Greek times, said, "A woman is an unfinished man who, like children and barbarians, are not competent in the ways of thinking." Thomas Dekker, in a book in 1604, said, "There is never music when a woman is in the concert." Hans von Bülow, very famous conductor in Germany in the late 1800s, said the following: "Reproductive genius can be admitted to the pretty sex, but productive genius unconditionally cannot. There will never be a woman composer, at best a misprinting copyist. I do not believe in the feminine form of the word creator." And then George Upton, a few years later in England, wrote a book called Women in Music, which you might think would be a good book about what women have done in music, but the whole book is about how women have been muses and inspiration for men to write music. And he wrote in this, "Not only are women too emotional and lacking in stamina to write music, but a woman's mind simply cannot grasp the scientific logic of music making. It does not seem that woman will ever originate music in its fullest and grandest forms. She will always be the recipient and the interpreter, but there is little hope she will be the creator." Now there is one woman who sort of responded to this in a wonderful way, Amy Fay, who was a great pianist in the 19th century, studied with Franz Liszt, and she wrote the following: "Women have been too much taken up with helping and encouraging men instead of placing a proper value on their own talent, which they are too prone to underestimate and to think not worth making the most of. Ruskin was quite right when he so patronizingly said that woman's chief function is to praise. She has praised and praised and praised and kept herself in abeyance. Women are finally beginning to realize that they too have brains, even musical ones. It has required 50,000 years to produce a male Beethoven. Surely 1 century ought to be allowed to create a female one." So It's really been a struggle for women composers, and obviously there have been women composers throughout our time. You go back to the Middle Ages. Hildegard von Bingen was this great spiritual mystic who wrote wonderful music, some of the wonderful early period musics from the 12th century on. There are Renaissance women, there are Baroque women, there are early classical women, but unfortunately they have just been neglected and forgotten. Some of them played during their lifetimes, but once they died, nobody bothered to republish their music. And so a lot of it has just been gone, and we don't know about it. And it's only been in the last 25 years or so that there's been a concerted effort academically to find some of this music, to make sure it's printed and published so that performers can actually play it. Because if we don't play this music, we don't know that it exists. And so we're really excited that some of this music has just become available in the past 10 or 15 years, and we can begin to play it and discover that, of course, women can be composers and can be wonderful composers as well. And so our first composer, her name is Louise Lebeau. Her full name, because she was of royalty, is Louise Caroline Marie Henriette Adolphe Lebeau, a lot of names there, born in 1850 in Rastatt, Germany, which is actually near where Anna lives now. She lives in Karlsruhe, in the southern part near the Black Forest, and that is where she grew up and went to school there. She was the only daughter of a military man who was also a good pianist himself, and he wanted to train his daughter in music. And so she started playing when she was 5 years old and started composing when she was 8 years old. And what have you been composing lately? You compose a little bit, right? Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, you probably started around that time. She went off to a couple different schools. She actually took lessons with Clara Schumann, the widow of Robert Schumann. She herself was a fantastic pianist and also a very good composer. We're finding more by Clara Schumann. So she taught Louisa for a while, and then she decided to go to Munich. And there was the Royal Music School there, a wonderful teacher named Josef Reinberger, who wanted to teach her. But at the time, women were not allowed to learn composing at the school. So he had to take her separately from the male students in order to teach her. And he thought she was pretty impressive. In fact, he wrote once, this woman writes music, very masculine music, unlike anything ever composed by a lady. Now, everybody was shocked when she would do that. There was another wonderful review of one of her pieces that said, "We have enormous respect for women whose activity brings them to the fore, and this composer is one of them. We think highly of her for going beyond the small and the paltry into the field of chamber music, for doing it with gusto, and for composing things that would do honor to any man." So they're always sort of being compared with what men can do. But what Louisa Lebeau brought was something really different. And she understood that she needed to help other young girls and women to become composers. So she ended up starting her own school in 1878 just for girls and daughters of the people who wanted to learn about music and to compose. In 1882, right after she wrote the piece that we're about to play, she wrote a cello sonata, which I played, a fantastic piece of music. And it won this big competition throughout Europe, beating out all the pieces written by men. And people were so shocked that it was written by a woman, they thought that maybe it was made up by somebody, a man, who used a woman's name, because it is such a powerful and energetic piece of music. But we have played that. She wrote a wonderful piano quartet. She gets invited to Berlin, and for a brief moment actually gets invited to teach in Berlin, but then they realized we're not letting any women teach at our school here, so she was not allowed to do that. And finally, in the early part of the 20th century, she heads to Italy, meets a man there by the name of Alfredo Di Giorgio, and unfortunately this happens to a lot of the women. Once they sort of get married, they stop composing, and she got married down there, and as far as we know, didn't compose again after that. She did write a book called Memoirs of a Female Composer in 1910, which exposed some of the troubles she had as a woman in this very male-oriented field. And today, just recently actually, the city of Baden-Baden, very near where Anna lives as well, has named their music library, the Lebeau Music Library, to honor her. So she's getting more and more, and hopefully you'll look her up. Really good work. And we're going to play three pieces that she wrote for viol. She wrote these at the same time that she wrote 4 pieces for cello. There were 2 brothers, the Becker brothers. One was a violist and one was a cellist. And so she wrote these pieces for them. The first one is called Nachtstück, a night piece. And you'll hear this very flowing accompaniment in the piano, which has a sort of water motif, as if there's like a babbling brook. And as Anna said, there is water that flows through Baden-Baden. and Brahms spent some time there. He also had that kind of accompaniment, so we can sort of hear the water in that first one. Then there's a really lovely, slow and dreamy second piece called Tramarai, which means dreaming. There's also a famous piece by Robert Schumann with that same title. And then finally, the last piece is a polonaise, and very much has that feeling of a Chopin polonaise with the great spirit of dance into it. So we hope you enjoy Louisa LeBeau, and please welcome Miss Anna Belzer. a little Louisa Lebeau, and now we're going to go to France, and the music of Fernand de Crook, who again is not a name that I knew much about, but have learned a little bit about her now. She was born in 1896, dies in 1954, most famous in the world of saxophone music. She actually wrote most of her pieces for saxophone. Her husband happened to be a pretty good saxophonist. And the saxophone was a relatively new instrument at the end of the 19th century, invented in France by Adolphe Sax. We think of it as a kind of a jazz instrument, but for the French, it was very much a classical instrument. A lot of French writers were writing music for the saxophone, and she sort of specialized in that. And this piece is actually best known as a saxophone piece, but it was actually originally conceived of in her mind as a piece for viola, although it lies better for the saxophone, so it's sort of a torturous piece for the violist to play. So that's maybe why she moved to do it on the saxophone. But it's interesting to hear it on a viola. Those who do know anything about de Crook know this piece. It was written in 1943 as the sonata for a saxophone. She was born in a small village, Gaillac, in southern France, studied originally at the Conservatoire de Toulouse, and then made it to the Paris Conservatory in 1918, and won lots of prizes there for composition and harmony, but especially for organ. She was a phenomenal organ player, and apparently was known for doing these concerts where she would just go into these places with organs, ask somebody for any theme that they wanted, and she could improvise for about 20 minutes on that theme and just make up whole concertos on this based upon that. So a really fine musical mind. She ultimately travels to America in the 1920s, and that's where she would meet her future husband, Maurice de Crook, who was actually a double bass player in the New York Philharmonic, but also played clarinet and saxophone, and would sometimes do saxophone concertos with the New York Philharmonic, coming out of the double bass section, which is kind of cool. Sadly, he did some nerve damage to his hands in the early 1930s and could no longer play an instrument. So he goes back to Paris and starts a publishing company known as Les Éditions de Paris, a very well-known publishing company that published de Crook's music, but also published a lot of popular French music. In fact, they were the ones who discovered Edith Piaf and published her first songs. So an important person in the publishing world. She would ultimately return to Toulouse herself and teach at the conservatory there, and would die of a stroke in 1954. Her music was played in her lifetime. There were reviews, if I can find it. One review of one of her symphonies said, "The names of musicians are inscribed upon rose petals," Schumann once said. "Instead, we must write Fernand de Crook on a laurel leaf. It would take much less than this incredible symphony to give this new musician the place to which he is entitled in our current musical scene." That was from 1943. But sadly, her music has not really survived after she died, except for this one piece, which now we will perform on the viola. It's the sonata in C-sharp minor, four movements. I forgot how many movements there are. And you'll hear in the beginning, the piano starts out sort of very low and grumbling from the ground as if the music is arising out of the earth. We then have a nice little dialogue with the viola and the piano. The second movement is a very sweet modal kind of piece. The third movement is entitled Filleuse, which means a spinner. So it's as if somebody's spinning thread, much like if you know Gretchen am Spinnrad by Schubert, this beautiful shape of the spinning wheel going. And then the last one has some very interesting harmonies in it. It's called a rondelle. But you'll hear in that this kind of, sometimes you hear a little of the, what we call bitonality. One hand is playing as if it's kind of an out-of-tune piano. That was something that Poulenc played a lot with. A lot of the French composers like to play in that tonality. You'll also hear this, some of the impressionistic sounds, like out of Debussy, what we call the pentatonic scale. Sometimes associated with more Asian music, or the whole tone scale. Again, all these scales that Debussy played a lot with, but some of the composers coming after him really love the colors that they set up, and so there's not always traditional diatonic harmony, but really some lovely colors. So here's Fernand de Crook. After this, we will take a short break for some wonderful food that Andy has provided for us, and then we'll come back, get to hear Yubi, and finish our program after that.